Alright, hello, it's Stephen Sadler again, reading to you from my book Money and Power, The Secret History. We've been talking about the CIA, and we've come now to the Iran-Contra affair, which I think serves as one of the best examples of how this supposed shadow government or elite within world banking work. In 1981, Ronald Reagan's now president, and George Herbert Walker Bush, or George Bush Sr., is now the vice president. And he'd just come over from being Director of Central Intelligence, or the CIA, which obviously suggests that he's had some experience in intelligence before becoming its director, yet that was never discussed in the press, and that's an important point I want you to note going forward. Anyway, he's assigned by President Reagan to be part of, or heading up, the crisis management staff of the National Security Council, so the special or covert operations. And in 1982, they created the Standing Crisis Pre-Planning Group, which was to train the Sandinistas, which were a political group from Nicaragua. You see, Zapata Oil and a lot of oil companies had rights to the oil off of Nicaragua's coast. And when this populist president was elected, he wanted to nationalize the oil industry so that the people of Nicaragua could share in the wealth of the nation's oil reserves. And of course, that was to take contracts and power away from people that had established it, so they had to kick that guy out and put in their own people. So the Reagan administration was working very diligently. Bush brought a number of people in from covert ops, Oliver North being the best known, but also there was Donald Grace and Felix Rodriguez and other members from the Central Intelligence Agency, covert operations. And when they started funding the development and training of the Sandinistas with the idea of taking over the government again, when our Congress found out, they created what was called the Bolin Amendment, and basically said, do not do that. We're not going to get involved in this, don't. Well, they circumvented that by creating the Smith-Richardson Foundation. The National Security Council worked through a private organization that raised money through religious groups and oil money donated to the Smith-Richardson Foundation to basically circumvent the Bolin Amendment. So what the Congress did, getting wind of this, is they created a second amendment, the Bolin Amendment 2, to state under no uncertain terms were they to fund, raise money, send arms, advise, or otherwise be involved in the Sandinistas, but Oliver North, Bush, and Reagan all directly countermanded that measure. And this is the part that I think Americans need to know that hasn't been told through the press. One of the suggestions that the Standing Crisis Pre-Planning Group developed under Bush was to sell missiles to Israel and then take the money and send it to the Sandinistas. Now this is interesting because Robert McFarlane, who was part of the security staff, was in the room, and he said that Bush, CIA director at the time, Casey, and President Reagan all said yes to that idea. And it was Secretary of State Schultz and Secretary of Defense Weinberger said no, because they saw obvious legal implications involved. There's also talk within the Iranian parliament saying that Bush was talking to them to try and trade arms for hostages, which we publicly made a statement that we weren't going to do that, yet they were doing it anyway. And here's the good part, though. The part most people don't know is that Bush Jr., George Herbert Walker Bush's son, who became our president, George Bush, we'll just call him Jr., a lot of people don't realize he became the CEO and major stockholder of a little oil company called Harkin Oil Company. And he brought in Sheikh Abdullah Bahish from the BCCI Bank, the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, I believe it's what they call it. It's known as a front group for the CIA. It's the world's biggest money laundering and arms trafficking bank in the world. And he brought in the director and himself, took over the ownership of the company, in other words, and then they used the Harkin Oil Company tankers to ship the missiles illegally to Iran. And by the way, Colin Powell was the one that actually did that. So you can see how they're all tied into the same CIA covert op, secret will get around the Congress. So while Bush was vice president, his son owned an oil company that took the missiles and sent them to Iran illegally. But what happened during the investigation and in the hearings is, since both the Bushes were considered CIA assets and Harkin Oil Company was considered a CIA asset, they wouldn't allow a lot of this information to become public. They kept going behind closed door sessions. That's how the elite protect themselves, under the auspices of secrecy. That you can't go there. You can't know who really owns the BCCI Bank or the Harkin Oil Company. Another interesting point is when the United States wanted to create a naval base. They were approaching different little countries in the Gulf, and one of them was Bahrain. Well, interesting, Bahrain was just starting to develop massive oil fields, and a contract was being given to the Amoco Oil Company. But all of a sudden, they pulled the contract from Amoco and gave it to little Harkin Oil Company. Isn't that interesting? And in return, Bahrain got the giant naval contract to house our naval base on their land, basically, which means they receive billions of dollars. So this is what really goes on in Washington. This is how the world really works, and I think every American needs to understand this. So help me spread the word. Tell your friends. Read Money and Power, The Secret History. Go to my blog. Go to YouTube. Inform yourself. And do independent investigation. It's that important if we're going to change the world.